Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Clean Tech, a roundup of the week's biggest stories you need to know in climate and clean energy in 15 minutes or less. Today is Friday, October 20th, 2023. I'm Renewable Energy World Editor-in-Chief John Ingle. Akshat Rathi will be joining us from Bloomberg here shortly, but once again, every week, I'm still joined by Cleantech PR veteran Mike Casey. Believe it or not. Mike, how's it going?
I think our listeners are giving me credit for putting up with you this long, Mr. Engel, but I'm well. How are you, sir?
I'm well as well, and I don't think that that's the case. I think that our banter is friendly and cordial, and I like to bust your chops for a number of things, your age notwithstanding. And I'm not ageist, by the way. You have thrown that out on social media multiple times now. I love doing this with you, Mike, and let's keep it rolling.
All right, John, hey, on a serious note to listeners here, I don't know about you, but I would say I hear from 1 to 2 listeners a week who, like, unprompted compliment the show. And it's really, I'd say to the listeners, it's really great to hear from you. Please keep that feedback coming. We would like to float a new feature that we want to try. It's the idea of the Clean Techer of the Week. So this is, listeners would use LinkedIn via comments on John or my page to name a clean techer who had done something impactful that week. Could be something big or small. Anyone can nominate anyone. We'll read through those nominations as we prepare for the show, pick one, then contact the nominee to confirm the fact set. And then we'll give that person a shout out on the show. So if you think that's a good idea, let us know. We're happy to try. It doesn't work, we'll get rid of it, but we wanted to give that a try here.
And last plug I'll give out, Mike, is next week. I'd get in trouble if I didn't throw this out. And audio podcast listeners will have heard the ads for Grid Tech Connect Forum for the last several months. Our event is in Newport, Rhode Island next week, so beginning October 23rd. If you are a DG developer, distribution utility, or regulator in the Northeast, this is going to be a lot of fun and taking on this critical issue of interconnection that we know is one of the biggest barriers to the energy transition. So please join us there if you can. Lastly, I'll say that we really appreciate those story recommendations that come in each week. So please send those to ThisWeekInCleantech at tigercom.us, and we'll always have that in the episode description as well. And none of these plugs take away from our 15 minutes. I'm going to say that at the outset to prevent the comments afterwards, because sometimes we got announcements, you know?
Absolutely.
All right, Mike, start us off.
Story number 1 is from the New Yorker's Heidi Blake, titled "The Great Cash for Carbon Hustle." Oh boy, John, what'd you think of this story?
Yeah, so here's the takeaway. The world's largest carbon offsetting firm, South Pole, issued millions of credits for carbon reductions that weren't real. Now, we know that carbon offsetting already receives loads of skepticism for a bunch of different reasons. So forest carbon projects in particular have lots of verification challenges. It's hard to prove what carbon pollution would have looked like absent any conservation matters, how much would have been logged without those protections. And then there's leakage. By protecting one place, or you solving one problem and just pushing it to another area. And then we've seen an increase in wildfires, which makes this even more complicated. Mike, what did you think?
Well, I don't want to sound like the Columbia Journalism Review here, but let me start by saying 2 things. First, I wish to God that we had never used the term climate change, because it's the most non-communicative descriptor for the greatest crisis we face. It would be much more accurate to call it climate destruction or climate disruption. Maybe we can get our friends in the media to start moving in the right terminological direction here. So second, in my 19 years in this space, I've got to say, I've never heard carbon offsets described as a, quote, fix for runaway emissions and climate change. It's always been a Band-Aid. It always will be a Band-Aid. I think that Heidi did some really great reporting here. I don't think that hyperbole was really necessary here. She did a great job. Really solid reporting showing that this Band-Aid had no sticking power. And the ugly picture the story presents is of South Pole dropping the ball on verifying that the money they were receiving for the credits is actually being used to preserve African rainforest. They lost track of tens of millions of dollars and how they were spent. And then on top of that, when they were presented with evidence that the threat to that forest area was not really as great as they were saying, they just doubled down. So I think I can speak to this. It's really clear that carbon offsets are going to keep living in mom's basement until a credible, strong, transparent certification system is established, and it cannot be run by companies with a financial self-interest in the system. John, what's story number 2?
Yeah, it's a familiar story. This one written by Tim McDonald for Semafor, titled "Why Arizona is Threatening to Pull the Plug on Solar." Mike, what'd you think?
Oh man, this is a walk down memory lane. We were involved in the solar wars in the Sun Belt in 2015 and 16. And back then, the corruption of the Arizona Public Service Commission was just blown wide open. It included an FBI investigation into water carrying by commissioners for APS. And I just have to say that, utilities have been dogged in trying to spin this idea that residential solar is somehow bad for other ratepayers when that's been debunked over and over again. And the idea here is that utilities should buy power from their customers at a lower rate than they sell power to those customers. I think this is basically a utility giveaway, plain and simple, and no amount of lipstick is going to make that pig look pretty. John, what'd you think?
Look, it's easy to point back to last year with NEM 3.0 in California. Arizona is not California, but that is a really exciting solar market. So it would be a real setback to see the economics thrown into question for rooftop solar in the state. What would happen from there? Is that as resilient as a market like California, which is now going through its own challenges because of the shift to time of use and incentivizing co-located battery storage? I don't think it is. And so something to watch really carefully. And I'm sure that industry there in the state is too. Mike, what's our next one?
Kat Clifford from CNBC wrote a story entitled, "These 7 U.S. regions will receive $7 billion in federal funding to produce hydrogen." John, your thoughts?
Yeah, I wrote on LinkedIn last week when this dropped that this is probably going to end up being one of the biggest stories of the year. And putting it out on a Friday is very White House-esque. But this is another product of President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law. The Department of Energy has picked 7 sites for hydrogen hubs to jumpstart that industry, and will be awarding around $1 billion a piece. And it varies. Some are lower, some are higher. Green hydrogen has been really tough to produce. It requires more energy than other fuels, but these hubs, or rather a collection of linked assets spread around the U.S., aim to tackle that problem. A lot of big players involved in this, but I have seen some questions about the quantity of blue hydrogen sites that were awarded. So carbon capture and storage with natural gas. That's something to watch out for. And another point that was put to me was the New England area, the Northeast U.S., largely got left out of this, which is kind of interesting politics at play geographically with how this all played out. Mike, what do you think?
I think these hubs are going to be a starting point. And I like you, I do think this is a story that's going to keep on producing progress and attention. Hydrogen is going to play an important role in the economy because it burns at high temperatures. It's useful for industry, and it can store energy for long periods of time without losses. So it's useful in lots of ways. I'd like to see more from the tax credit. I think the folks in the thermal storage space have a lot to say about the fairness of the attention that government is giving hydrogen right now, setting that aside. I think that hydrogen, and green hydrogen in particular, it's a great idea. Let's see how well it gets deployed commercially after the policy handoff here is completed. John, what's our fourth story?
Just a point on that, Mike, we're still waiting for the definitions on the tax credits from Treasury. Everyone's patiently waiting for that. And I think it's supposed to come later this year or early next year. I had the head of hydrogen for Xcel, that's part of the Heartland Hub, tell me that the definition of that credit will determine if this is a huge impact, a big hub, or something considerably scaled back. So I think that spectrum is quite large. And I think that's an important aspect of this story, that it is by far a sure thing. Okay, our fourth story here, we have one from Bloomberg titled "Plus Power Raises $1.8 billion for U.S. battery projects." And we will acknowledge, Mike, this is one of your clients, but I advocated for this to be in the show because I think it's a big deal. What do you think?
Yeah, I think Abby Hopper commented on the post I did on LinkedIn that this is wholly BFD. I mean, if you want to see how storage is really taking off to meet the needs of an underbuilt transmission system to handle more clean energy on the grid, you can't get around the centrality of the role of utility scale battery storage. And Plus has raised this huge amount of money for 5 lithium ion battery projects in Texas and Arizona. And I think with the intersection of extreme weather and changing sources of energy on an aging grid, storage is going to become more and more a place of focus in the national conversation on the energy transition. John, what do you think about this?
Well, first takeaway is that standalone energy storage, battery storage developers didn't really stand much of a chance to scale before the Inflation Reduction Act expanded the ITC to let them separate from solar projects. The second thing I take away is I'm talking pretty much every week about the disaster that is the tax equity investment market. Well, for an established, reputable player like Plus Power, they had no problem securing a record setting tax equity investment. So I think that's telling us something about how investors are viewing risk in the platforms that they want to partner with. The frothiness of old isn't going to cut it anymore. So we might have a thinning out of the herd in respect to the people who can access that critical financing mechanism for clean energy. Mike, what's our last one?
So number 5 is a Bloomberg story written by Kira Bindram, Oscar Boyd, and our guest Akshat Rathi, titled "Climate Change Can't Overcome Capitalism, and That's Okay." And that's actually Akshat's book. I think this is the first book author we have had on our show, so we're really fired about having you, Akshat. Welcome to the show, and tell us what prompted you to write the book.
It's nice to be here. Well, I've been a journalist covering climate change for 6-7 years now, and there was a big gap I saw, at least when I pitched the book in 2019, between what people thought about where we are on the climate trajectory, solutions trajectory, and where things actually were. Now, a lot of the stories you just talked about were tied to the Inflation Reduction Act, which, passed a little more than 12 months ago. But the reality is the climate transition has been kind of in motion and actually scaling quite rapidly everywhere in the world. The US is a little bit late to the party, if anything. And I wanted to show that that's the case. I wanted to look at success stories in China, in India, in Denmark, in the UK, and not just technology success stories, because, of course, there are many of those: solar, batteries, electric cars, all the things we talk about here on the show often, but all the systemic things that make these things actually scale. So laws, finance, venture capital, all the things that actually make the glue that sticks the energy transition as we need it.
Akshat, based on your research for the book and taking into account all of the factors that are at play right now, the Inflation Reduction Act you mentioned last year, Europe went in a similar direction, albeit at a different degree, to incentivize domestic manufacturing and all these things. Now we have this backdrop of macroeconomic pressures, inflation, interest rates. How do we characterize the state and the rate of the energy transition at that point, and squaring it with, capitalistic structures?
It is a little bit 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We experienced a COVID pandemic, a recession, the war in Ukraine, now a war in Israel, Gaza. And all of these things are sucking up oxygen at a global level, both for politics but also for capital. And it's coming because of inflationary pressures with high interest rates. So there has been a slowdown. There is no way around it. But the slowdown could have been far worse had we not had the alternatives at the kind of price level that they are. So it's not like solar and wind have suddenly come to a halt. Yes, wind companies in Europe are not doing very well, but wind deployment continues. Yes, it's slowed down a little bit, but compared to 3 years ago, it's still thrice the level. And so it is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I think that is going to be the nature of the transition, at least as far as we can see it, because it's not going to be the smooth curve that a climate model tells you we can take.
If you had to name one surprise that is going to be the biggest, what's the biggest surprise that your readers of this book are going to have when they turn the last page?
That capitalism can play a role, but only if policy and people come alongside it to make the technologies work. Money is there to be made, but it won't be made if there is no direction given to the markets from government. It doesn't have to be intervention. It doesn't have to kill competition, but it definitely requires direction, certainty, and policy investments. I would say that's not surprising, but it would be surprising by the end of it because you'll have read through the success stories, and that message, I hope, will land in a more impactful way than it has ever before.
What are you most interested in now? I'm assuming your day-to-day reporting had to take a bit of a backseat to the book, and that's a labor of love to a degree. What are you watching now as you kind of open back up your reporter notebook and get into the mix?
Over the next couple of months, I'm actually looking very closely at carbon capture. And this is something, again, you would have talked about, especially in the US, where the technology has been scaled up the most and where there are the highest incentives available to be able to capture those emissions, transport it, and sink it. And yet, despite all this, which has happened not just in the Inflation Reduction Act, but also under Trump, because it has bipartisan support, this technology, there have been very few projects that have been announced or built in that period. And we're going into this period over the next couple of months into COP28, which is going to be held in UAE, an oil-producing country headed by a president who's the CEO of the national oil company there. And the oil industry is going to show up in full force because they want it to be an all-inclusive COP. Everybody shows up. And one solution that the oil and gas industry can build, wants to talk about, is carbon capture. But where are the projects?
John, I'm afraid we're running out of time. We need to give a shout out to our wonderful producer, Brian Mendez, and thank Claire Quirin and Alex Peterson for gathering our stories this week.
Yeah, and thanks to Akshat for joining us on this episode of This Week in Clean Tech. Please make sure you subscribe and give us feedback and share your story recommendations, as well as that Clean Techer of the Week recommendation. So keep those in mind and let us know. You can read all of the articles we discussed this week by clicking the links in the episode description, and check out Monday's episode of Factor This. We have the CEO of Clean Capital joining us to talk about the mess that is clean energy capital markets right now. We'll see you next time. Mike, great to see you.
See you in 2 weeks, my friend. Take care.